Why were there no riots last night? It's a critical question because if we as a society want to understand what's happened these past 2 weeks, these past 10 years, if we don't want to see a repeat of the violence that we witnessed across the country following the killing of those poor girls up in Southport, then we must surely need to understand why it stopped. Much has happened in a little less than 2 weeks of civil unrest. Paradoxically, very little has changed. Yes, we now have 3 families in mourning, their hearts shattered by violence, but we also still have roughly the same amount of migrants that we did 2 weeks ago. The streets are still owned by whoever really owns the streets. It's increasingly common in London to find it's not the council, but a faceless corporation. I digress. I've no idea, truthfully, if more people have arrived by boat or fewer over the past 2 weeks. The numbers are small beer, aren't they, in the grand scheme of things? But I assume, please, dear listener, please correct me if you think I'm wrong. I assume that we still have roughly the same number of angry people out there that we did 2 weeks ago this Tuesday. People so angry they burnt a hotel with people in it. Endless scenes of looting, libraries burned, Citizens Advice Bureau razed to the ground by self-styled patriots. Why was no one at it again yesterday? Hey, what's changed? Strikes me, again, cool if I'm wrong, cool if I'm right. Strikes me the whole far-right anti-Muslim riot thing, the Farage riots, as people sharper than me have christened them, they started fizzling out on Wednesday, didn't they? And I did have the misfortune of seeing a post by I won't name them, by a celebrity race baiter earlier that day, which was directing people to about a dozen different locations in England where patriots were going to gather that evening. A useful guide, frankly, to where the next racist riots might be taking place, I thought. But none did. Why? What brought a halt to these protests? They seem to have stopped as suddenly as they've started. Is it one thing or is it a combination of things? While there were no riots on Wednesday in England, there were a few protests, tiny little ineffectual things, but that's because Wednesday night, frankly, was owned by the anti-fascists who turned out in huge numbers in the same locations that had been named on social media. The people of Brighton, the people of Walthamstow in particular, stood out. Bloody thousands of you. Dignified and peaceful you were too, but in terms of sheer numbers, I think we'd have to accept that from a far-right would-be rioter's perspective, you must have looked terrifying. Did rioters and the fascists finally wake up maybe and smell the coffee that while their complaints have been amplified on social media, the reality is that they are massively, massively outnumbered by decent people? The message somehow seems to have penetrated the walls of the Daily Mail, which of course has done nothing but demonise migrants for years. But the rag has suddenly swapped sides like it did in World War II and has started demonising racist rioters instead. Has that turned the tide? Did the combination of losing the right-wing press's support and those huge crowds of anti-fascists suggest the good times for looting and hurting communities were over? I don't know. Pick up the phone. You'd have to be a very brave rioter or a very stupid one, I think, to take on such a huge crowd of antis. Something else notably different about the aftermath of these latest disturbances compared to previous riots were their high-profile, often televised court hearings and hefty sentences, and I would think they must have helped persuade the mob to go home and chill out in front of their Chinese-made TVs and computers. I have to say, I found it a cathartic experience from a viewer's perspective to see some of the same animals caught on camera mid-riot being made to stand before the beak, weeping like babies, hanging from the booze and offering a variety of lame excuses. I didn't know there was a riot going on down there. It's been a very demonstrative way of doing justice. Demonstrative. I had my doubts. I feared they might whip up more violence, but there were no riots last night. So I have to wonder if the threat of remand and a spell in chokey has persuaded hardcore self-styled patriots to just suck it up like everybody else. Or, and I'm going to be a little bit disingenuous here, was it the return of the football this weekend? Did that rob the far right of its rabble? I was astonished to read detectives are only just starting to investigate possible links between football and the far right, which is curious, as I thought they were doing that in the 70s and the 80s. Anyway, the footy's on, the streets are clear, so maybe. 0345 6060 973 is the number for your thoughts and theories as to why the rioting has stopped. I'm turning for guidance, first of all, to Professor Anthony Glees, a security expert from the University of Buckingham. Good morning to you, Anthony.
Good morning, Matthew.
Why do you think the riots fizzled out?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons, but I think some reasons are more important than others. And I would home in on three reasons in particular. First of all, this hard fact that 85% of Brits said they opposed the riots. When has anybody ever seen 85% of Brits agree on anything?
Well said.
There was massive, massive support for action to stop the riots. It's true that 58% feel there should be a discussion of the background to the rioting, and I think that does include our attitude towards immigration and towards immigrants. That's there, but that's for another day. And of course, we can't speak about that because of the very sensible sub judice rule. I think the second reason was the use of the social media by everybody involved. That is to say, by the rioters, by the cops, and by the counter-rioters, because what we saw, particularly in Walthamstow, as you said, you had people using the social media to say, we're going to go there and we're going to show that these mobs of people, who include young idiots, off their tits on drugs and so on, but also some of those creepy, middle-aged and elderly Nazis, the sort of Mosleyites who dogged this country for years. We saw them on the television standing behind the young people, telling them where to go and what to do.
Just on that, Anthony, I mean, social media was one of the causes. It was being blamed for fueling the riots the previous week, and so you're now saying it's both a negative force and a positive force.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
So.
Interesting. I agree.
You had idiots like Elon Musk doing his best to say. Yeah, Elon Musk said on Tuesday there was going to be civil war in Britain.
Yes.
On Wednesday, and his behaviour has been throughout. I think a lot of people are going to leave Twitter. It's his toy. Well, he can play with it in America. What he's got to do with this country is not entirely clear. But look, there's a third reason, in my opinion, and the third reason is our Prime Minister. I said, when people were kind enough to ask me on Tuesday, we're fearing riots on Wednesday, and Sir Keir Starmer and the cops, the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, have made it very clear they have a policy. And the way they want to deal with this is by using facial recognition technology, for example. There's a really important thing that they said there, because for years, people like me have had verbal battles with civil liberties groups who say, we don't want CCTV, it's an infringement of our... If you've done something wrong and there's a camera that captures you, in my opinion, a national security opinion, you should cop it. So you got a Labour government, a socialist Prime Minister, actually behaving, dare I say it, like a Conservative Prime Minister.
I think socialist Prime Minister might be pushing it just a little, I think.
Well, he calls himself a socialist, yes. I think. But it's a law and order offer that he has provided. And remember, how many times did Boris Johnson in particular ridicule him before the nation for being a lawyer, my learned friend?
I was also thinking about Boris Johnson ridiculing and humiliating Muslim people in this country, which probably wasn't very helpful either.
Looking like letterboxes and so on.
Yes.
Well, what I think is, Starmer has used... Is he, of course, his expertise, this area. He was, as everybody knows, in charge of the Crown Prosecution Service in 2011, the London riots. Of course, there were riots in other cities. We call them the London riots. To get people identified, arrested, and locked up, and to show that in this country we may have an honest debate about immigration and immigrants, but we're jolly well not going to go down the, dare I say it, road to rioting and national disorder that we have seen in other countries and in parts of other countries. In Eastern Germany, for example, where in a year or two ago, the far right burnt down an immigrants' hostel. People get killed. The firebombing in Rotherham, I think, repulsed and disgusted.
I think
country.
you're right. Professor Glees, thank you. Now, listening to that was a former superintendent from the Met, Nusrit Mehtab, now working at the University of East London. Good morning to you. I should just, by the way, just apologise for the rather colourful language you might have heard from the professor earlier. And Nusrit,
good morning, Matthew.
Good morning. Where would you like to start on the question of why the riots fizzled out?
Well, I think there's a fourth element, Matthew, because about 500 rioters have been arrested as well.
700, I think, the last figure I saw in the media, actually, yes.
So they probably all, some have been remanded and some are still community orders and things. But I think that did contribute. I certainly agree with what the professor said. You know, it's kind of the approach the Prime Minister has taken has been a no-nonsense approach.
Yes.
You know, this swift justice. I mean, it really does focus the mind that if, you know, you think you've got away with it for whatever reason, you're at home and you get that knock on the door. And some people were expecting it. So I think the use of social media, the use of, you know, putting them on telly.
I was just going to, if we can explore that for a moment, because I found that, I mean, this is just my personal take on it. I just found it. I can't remember the last time I'd seen British justice on camera. And it was, as I said in my introduction, it was a cathartic experience for me as a viewer, watching the rioters getting justice and seeing them in the cold light of day. So I think that was a good thing for us.
Oh, it certainly was. And then the pictures all coming on, you know, to say this has happened, people losing their livelihood. But not everybody watches, you know, glued to the TV, but it was social media as well. People were sharing images. You know, some of them saying how awful it was. These poor people had been, you know, the right of free speech had been taken away. So everybody, I don't think there was anybody that didn't know what was happening.
True.
These people were on telly. And, you know, as we know, certain people have lost their livelihoods, lost their jobs, have now got a criminal record. And it really does, I think, focus the mind. I also think that, you know, Wednesday, when we had those awful images, I think many people, the fact that people were trying to set light to a building, that changed a lot of things, and people just did not want to be associated with it, along with the community spirit. You know, people coming out and saying, no, these are our streets.
In huge numbers and peaceful and dignified. That was the thing that I was so struck by.
Yeah, I mean, and, you know, the atmosphere, absolutely electric to say no. And I think that gave everybody a lot of hope. Those people that were victim to it, you know, the anti-Muslim rhetoric, it is Islamophobic. I know we went from protests to demonstrations to, okay, it's a riot now. But actually, they were Islamophobic riots. And watching the community spirit of people, all, you know, of all communities, watching that sitting at home, it gave them hope that actually people are not acceptable, you know, accepting what's happened. And that goes a long way to giving that community reassurance. Well, I was going to ask, making people slightly safe.
I was going to ask you, it's the critical question ultimately, I suppose, is that chapter, this far right Islamophobic rioting, do we think this chapter is closed? Are we done with it? Can we expect no more riots this year? Have the combination of all the things we've talked about made it clear that we're not going to tolerate it in this country?
I would like to say yes, but I'm not 100% sure, because don't forget, as you kind of mentioned as well, there is a connection between football and the far right. In fact, 70% of those that were arrested had criminal backgrounds, and, I mean, they had violence and things, but they also had football banning orders.
Right.
So it kind of gives you an idea of the type of people, and we've got football coming on. I don't think, you know, I think, unfortunately, I don't want to be a pessimist, but I think we should stay alert. I think there's a lot more work to be done for the Prime Minister. I think he needs to start, you know, once a couple of weeks' time when everything is, the dust is settled. I think the police will still be on high alert. They're not going to put down their resources. They've really managed it well. And, you know, I mean, we've got to give a shout out to the police officers. And I'm the first one to criticise them when they're, you know, when they do something wrong. But I think their approach as well.
I think right at the beginning, I think one of the most upsetting aspects of it was the police were the target right at the beginning of the riots. Nusrit, lovely talking to you. Nusrit Mehtab there, former superintendent from the Met Police. Listen to Matthew Wright on LBC. It's interesting that I think so far the guests and myself feel it's a combination of things. After the break, we'll hear from you. Maybe you were planning to riot. What stopped you? Were you scared of meeting anti-fascists? Maybe you were one of those who turned out to oppose the riots. Are you confident we've closed that particular chapter?